Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar React to Real-Time Market Data with n8n and QuestDB. My name is n8n, and I'll be the moderator for the webinar today. I have with me Harshil and Brian, who will be presenters for today. Harshil is a junior developer advocate at n8n. He's an Auth0 ambassador and a Mozilla representative. Harshil enjoys experimenting with new tools and technologies, building cool stuff, and sharing his knowledge with the community. Brian is a technical writer at QuestDB who loves building great developer documentation and hacks on open source software, Python, Node.js, Ruby, Arduino, Swagger docs, and cellular IoT. So before I pass over to Harshil and Brian, a few housekeeping things. So feel free to send any questions that you might have throughout the duration of this webinar via the chat panel on the right, and we'll answer questions at the end of the webinar. We also have a couple of polls that we'll be asking throughout the presentation, so watch out for them. Also, if you have any problems with sound or if you can't see the presentation or something like that, please let me know through the chat. And with that, I would like to hand over to our presenters, Harshil and Brian.
Thanks, Tony. Oh, Harshil, I think you're muted.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, that's
okay. So welcome to the webinar, React to Real-Time Market Data with n8n and QuestDB. So there have been a lot of ups and downs in the financial markets over the last few months. So in this webinar, we are going to build workflows that will automate the process of monitoring Bitcoin's value for real-time insights. You can modify this workflow to monitor the stock market as well. So talking about monitoring, Brian, how do people generally keep themselves updated with the ever-changing price of Bitcoin?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, usually people who are checking Bitcoin prices for maybe if you're doing this on the side, if something that's an interest for you in terms of personal finances, maybe this is something that probably involves a lot of manual effort and requires a fair bit of effort, especially if you're going to try and get a little bit serious about it and build some automations. If you want to code something, obviously this takes quite a bit of time, and you have to invest a bit of time in figuring out how to interact with APIs and grab the information that you're interested in, and then of course react on that. So yeah.
Makes sense. So it's more of a manual work if you want to not code your own automation for that, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few resources out there for building various different tools based on. I mean, I think the Python ecosystem. There's quite a lot of stuff out there for people building automated tools, but it takes a while to figure out what the platforms are giving you back, or what kind of system that you want to build. So this is pretty time intensive, right?
Gotcha. And that's where n8n comes into place. So today we will build an automation workflow which will ingest Bitcoin's value in a database. We'll build another workflow that will use this value, query the data, and then send us this information on Slack. Now, talking about n8n, n8n is a fair code license tool that helps you automate tasks, sync data between various sources, and react to events all via a visual workflow editor. To use n8n, you can either host it on your servers or sign up for n8n Cloud. So when you access your n8n instance, you are greeted by an editor UI where you build your workflow. Now, as you see in the image over here, this is the workflow that we will build today. Now, workflow is a key component of n8n. A workflow can be started manually, or it can be triggered by an external event. So the workflow in this image gets triggered whenever we issue a / command. Now, if you see over here, all these integrations, these are the nodes in n8n, which are another key component. Now, these nodes are the building blocks of the workflow. And currently there are 270 plus nodes in n8n, which you can use to build your own automation. So again, coming back to this image, you see that we have different nodes over here. We have a node for QuestDB, which can perform a certain operations. We have another node for Slack, which can post a message from Slack, post a message to Slack, get some information from Slack as well. So there are a lot of options over here. So Brian, so now that we are introduced to n8n, what would be the next steps involved in our workflows?
So, okay, we have to first get the data that we're interested in. We have to store it somewhere, and then we have to ask questions about what that data looks like. So the perfect tool for this job is basically a time series database.
Awesome. Okay. So let's first take a look at the editor UI. Now, when you open the editor UI, you will be greeted by a couple of options over here, and they give you a lot of flexibility. So they give you the option to create a new workflow, open an existing workflow, even download a workflow, and there are a lot of options. And I would encourage you all to go ahead and check them out. Now, by default, there is a start node. The workflow starts from the start node, and the start node cannot be deleted. Talking about nodes, there are two different nodes in n8n. The first is the trigger node. These nodes start the automation and supply all the required information to our workflow. So for example, in one of our workflows, we will use an interval node that will trigger our workflow to run every second. The next are the regular nodes, which basically do the actual work. So they can add, remove, and edit the data in the flow, as well as request and send data to external APIs. So an example over here would be the QuestDB node. The other example is the ConGecko node. So as mentioned, we will use the interval trigger node to trigger a workflow to run every second. I will add the interval node. Now by default, it is configured to run every second, but let's just say you want to run it for 5 minutes. So you can just set the interval time in the interval field and select the unit to minutes. But again, we want to run it every second, so I'm gonna change it back to the default values. Now we have a trigger node. The next thing we want to do is we want to get some values from the CoinGecko node. I'm gonna select the CoinGecko node, and one of the things I like about the CoinGecko node is you don't have to go ahead and sign up on CoinGecko to create your own account and get those API keys. So it makes it really easy to quickly get started. Now, if you see over here, we also have a lot of operations in the CoinGecko node, and we are interested in the price operation over here. And we want to search the coin by ID, and there are options for base currency. So this would be Bitcoin in our use case. So I would do BTC. Now you can add multiple base currencies. So let's just say you are building this workflow to get information for Ethereum as well. So you can add Ethereum as well. But I am just interested in Bitcoin at the moment. And the quote currencies that I want to use are USD as well as Euro. Now if I execute this node, it will get the value from CoinGecko. So we see now the value of Bitcoin in USD as well as Euro. And this is a bit expensive. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is we want to use a set node that will basically set some information that we want to ingest in QuestDB. Now talking about this, Brian, we have this data that would be coming every second, right? So for such kind of ingestion, what kind of database should we use?
Yeah, so we should use a time series database. So this slide here about what time series data is. So time series data, we're all familiar with it. So this graph here on the left is Apple's share price over time. that's all time series data is basically. We're just looking at the changes of some value of some metrics over time. So the difference there between traditional databases is you would just store and receive the latest known value for something. So let's say you had a customer and you changed the customer address, and then you want to fetch that information. You just have the latest known state. But a time series database is perfect when you want to have the history of the change of this metric over time. So yeah, this one quote here at the bottom of the slides, I think was fairly astonishing, right? That in 2017, this IBM study stated that 90% of the data in the world had been created in 2015 and 2016. So that's pretty surprising when you think about it, but this indicates, right, that we have this explosion of information, and we're interested in collecting more of the information that we're generating and trying to make sense of it. And the more information that we have and the more that we're trying to make sense of it, it breeds this necessity to have new tools that are specialized in tracking how these metrics change over time. And then this graph here on the right is basically showing the rise in popularity of time series databases. So you can see it's the fastest growing category of database at the moment, which is, I'd say, a side effect of the prevalence of time series data, right? That it's pretty much everywhere, and people are realizing that the value of tapping into this, right?
Awesome. So thanks for explaining time series data. So now I'm just a bit curious. So what kind of database should I use? So I know I have to use time series, but what should be, the service that I should use?
Well, of course, I'd recommend QuestDB. So typically, when you ask an engineer or a developer what the slowest part of their stack is, it's typically the database. And this is really commonly a bottleneck in most services. So QuestDB has been, since 2013, it's been under development. It's undergone several major revisions, and right now, is open source. Version 5.06 is the latest. And it uses SQL as a query language, which is big advantage over a lot of other different systems where you have to learn a specific DSL, where you have to learn some kind of esoteric query language. So SQL has been around for 50 years now. So it's battle tested. It's pretty much a favorite in a lot of the analytics world because it answers questions about data very intuitively, right? So you have a lot of common English keywords that make sense when you're reading it, and it's just the right language that you need for asking questions about what data looks like.
That's good. So I don't have to learn another language. I can reuse my knowledge of SQL.
Exactly, yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a table in QuestDB. So Brian, would you help me out? My knowledge of
course.
SQL is a bit rusty at the moment.
Yeah, so what we need to do is use create table keywords.
Okay, so it's create table and then the table name.
Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. And over here, I specify the fields.
Yeah, so we're interested in two metrics, right? So we need one for USD, and this one we want to give it a type, so we can say float in this case.
Okay, and then EUR would again be float.
Exactly. And then there's a third metric that, of course, we're interested in, which is the time.
Right. So what type this would be?
And this one is a timestamp.
Okay.
Type.
Right.
So at this point, this query will run perfectly fine. But what QuestDB has is a feature that allows us to index this timestamp row. So what we can do at this point is use a timestamp function. So it's just after your closing bracket there. Yeah. Timestamp,
And then main.
open, close. Yep. And then the timestamp column.
Awesome, interesting.
So by designating one column as our timestamp, then we have extremely fast performance on reads, on queries, basically.
Oh, okay. So I'm just gonna hit unrun. Awesome, I got a message that the table was created. Now if I refresh this, I see my table. That's good. So now we have a table in QuestDB which has fields that's USD, EUA, and timestamp. So now I know what fields I want. I'm gonna use the set node to set these values. Now in the set node, you can set either a boolean that's true or false, a number, or a string. Since all these values that we get are number, I'm gonna select number. And the name I am gonna enter is USD. Now the value in the name field should be exactly the same that you have in your table. And now we want to get this value from the previous node. So I'm going to click on add expression, which opens the expression editor for us. And then reference this value from the previous node, USD. And I'm going to do this same for EUR as well. So number, EUR, and then reference the value from the previous node. Now here's a quick pool for you all. Since I am not getting the value for timestamp, right? I'm just curious if we can use some kind of code snippet in the expression editor to run to create this timestamp for us. Please let me know what do you all think. Okay, so moving forward, I see 100% of the audience said yes. So that's good. Yes, we can run code snippets in in the expression editor. So over here we are gonna create a timestamp. Again, I'm gonna open the expression editor. And in this, I am gonna run JavaScript code snippet. So to run a code snippet, you have to use curly braces and wrap it in the curly braces. I'm using the JavaScript date object, and I am gonna now since we have to pass on the timestamp in milliseconds, I'm multiplying it by 1000. So we use the date object, and we are using the .now method, which will give me the exact timestamp. And then I am multiplying by 1000 to convert it into milliseconds. Now, if I execute this node, it will give me the information that I've created in this particular node, but it also gives me the information from the previous node, which I am not interested in. So I'm gonna toggle keep only set to true. And if I execute it, we'll only see the information that we have set in this particular node. So you see now we just got the USD, EUR, and timestamp. So we now have the data that we want to ingest to QuestDB. So let's get the QuestDB node. Now for QuestDB, you have to create your own credentials. So you can click on create new, enter the name for your credentials, select the host. I am currently running it locally on my machine. So it's going to be localhost. And I'm just using the default value. So I'm not going to change any of this. Now again, I have already set these credentials for myself, so I'm not going to go ahead and create it. But if you want to know more how you can create your own credentials, you can click on the open credential doc link over here. This will take you to our documentation where you can learn how you can create these credentials. So I'm going to select the credentials that I already created.
I think we may have lost Harshal for the moment.
Sure. No worries. While he comes back, so tell me a bit about QuestDB? Because I see in the chat we had a question around how does QuestDB compare to Postgres and InfluxDB?
Yeah, so with Postgres, so what QuestDB has is a Postgres connector, or at least we allow people to read and write data through Postgres. So any programming language that you're using has packages that allow you to read and write to databases using this credential. So that opens up quite a lot of compatibility. Also allows people to easily integrate with their own existing stack, right? So it's fairly easy to get up and running with the Postgres credentials. Then with Influx, Influx is also a time series database. We also support reading data through InfluxDB line protocol, and this is typically for higher ingestion. So we can write quite a lot faster using InfluxDB line protocol. That would be, let's say, in an industrial setting, or if you're writing maybe 1 million records per second, that's the kind of use case that you would use InfluxDB line protocol. But otherwise, for compatibility or for reading, you would use Postgres.
Got it.
Yeah.
So that's cool. So you can basically use the InfluxDB line protocol in addition to the standard SQL as well.
That's right. Yeah. So we also have a REST API, which is useful for bulk exports or for bulk importing, but typically, high ingestion rates, people are using InfluxDB line protocol, and then for querying the data using Postgres connector.
Cool, perfect. All right, it seems Harshal is back, and while Harshal shares his screen, I had another question for you, Brian, was around. So I think it's more of based on what Brian said, is like the Postgres via protocol. So that's really cool because the nodes in n8n are actually written in TypeScript. So we also use the Postgres via protocol, and that's how we are communicating to QuestDB as well. Cool. All right. Then please take it ahead, Brian and Harshal.
Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. So Brian, I was talking about that we now have this workflow running, right? And it is executing every second and ingesting some data to QuestDB. So we will be having a lot of data in QuestDB. So how can we make sense of all this data?
Yeah, so now what we want to do is query from this, and we want to ask what are the trends in this data over time. So we need to be able to ask that in a convenient way from QuestDB.
Awesome. So we would be running some kind of queries then.
Yeah, so we can run SQL queries.
So can you just take us through a few queries that we can?
Of course, yeah. So here we're on the web console. So here we can write some more queries directly. So if we want to see what's in the BTC table, we can do it the long way, which is select star from BTC. And this should give us everything that's in the table so far. All right, so we have 56 rows. The shorthand is you can get rid of the select star from. So we can just write BTC. And that'll give us everything, the same result.
That's interesting.
Okay, so one of the main benefits of Quest is that we have a few SQL extensions for time series data. So let's say I want to make and let's say first let's have a look at the average. So let's do a select average.
This is a function, right?
Yeah, that's a function. Yeah. So we need open close brackets. USD from BTC. So this will give us one row,
Mhm.
And that's the average across the entire
Right.
table. So that's all of 56 rows or
Mhm.
however many we have. So let's say we want to create 1 minute
Mhm.
aggregates or 5 minute aggregates and see what the average during those 5 minute buckets are. What we can do here is add a sample by.
Okay. Sample by, and then we specify the time.
That's it. So we can do one or the number and then followed by the unit. So we can do 1M
Mhm.
for 1 minute. And we need a timestamp would be good as well. So
Okay.
we can do select the average
Mhm.
USD and the timestamp. That's it. Right. So we have 3 rows. So our workflow has been going for 3 minutes. And then for each of these 1 minute buckets, then we have an average of what the USD
Mhm.
value is.
Interesting. Mhm.
So if you had a table that's maybe has a month worth of data, you can sample by day, you can sample by hour, of course, and split this into aggregates, however fine grained you want the averages to run by.
Awesome. That's really interesting. So for the units for hour and days, it would be H and D respectively.
It's so for days, then you would instead of 1M, you would use one lowercase d,
Okay.
um, and for month is M.
Got it.
Exactly.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
So now this makes more sense to me. And being an automation enthusiast, I won't, like to come to the console every time I want to run a query. So what I'm gonna do is I am gonna build a new workflow which will connect my n8n workflow with my Slack workspace, right? So this would also help me get the output on a mobile phone. So let's just say I am using Slack on my phone and I just run this slash command so that and this will give me the output on my phone as well. Also, I think this would help me, to make better decisions whenever someone tweets about Bitcoin or whenever Elon Musk, tweets about cryptocurrency.
Of course. Yeah.
Awesome. So talking about Slack, we first need to create a slash command in Slack. So to create a slash command, you have to first log into your Slack account and then head over to api.slack.com and then click on create a custom app. So now we have to enter an app name. So I'm gonna call this Bitcoin Picker and select the workspace. So I'm gonna use a dummy workspace at the moment. So now our application is created. The next thing is to create a slash command. So I'm going to click on slash commands, click on create new command, and I can define the command that I want. So I'm gonna call this avg, that's short for average. And over here it is asking for a request URL. So now this is the URL that I will get from the webhook node. So let's go back to n8n. So now since I want to create a new workflow, I'm going to click on new and now add the webhook trigger node. Now in the webhook trigger node, there are two different URLs, a production URL and a test URL. We use the production URL when we have completed building a workflow and a workflow is in active state. That is, we are not executing the workflow manually. Since we are building this workflow, I'm going to use the test URL. I'm going to click on this to copy the URL. Another important thing to note over here is the Slack makes a post request. So instead of get, I will change the HTTP method to post. And now I will add it to my command over here. Also, I have to give a short description. So I'm just going to give it a short description, help me make decision and save this. So now my slash command is also created. The next step is to install it on your Slack workspace. To install to workspace. and I have to give it allow it. So I'm just allowing it to get added, and awesome. So my application is now added to my Slack workspace. So now let's test it out. So the first thing is you have to save your workflow whenever you are using a trigger node. This would register the webhook ID. So I'm going to save this first. I'm also going to call this help me make decision. And then I'm going to execute the node. I'll come to my Slack workspace. I've created a channel called Bitcoin where I'll make the average. Yeah, I issued the average slash command and I see some output over here. Now if I go back to n8n, we can see some data that's written uh, by the slash command. So over here you can see that we get the channel ID, the channel name. We also get the command that was ran and also the text if the user passes on some text. So let's just try to pass on some information and see what we get. AVG, and I'm just going to do 1M. Again, we got a message over here, and if I go back to n8n, I can see the information and the text as well. So we oftentimes might want to query data for a different sample, right? For currently we are sampling it for 1 minute, but I just say I want to sample it out for 5 minutes. So it wouldn't make sense to open the workflow, change the query, and then save the workflow and then run the slash command. So what I'm going to do is I am going to use an if node, which would check if the user has passed on a parameter with the slash command or not. And if they have passed on the parameter, we will create a dynamic query, which will query that based on the sample, and then we'll return that value. If the user does not pass a parameter, we will have a default query, which will get executed and will share that result on Slack. I'm going to do the if node and I'm going to add a condition. And over here, since the value that I'm getting is a string, I'm going to select string. I'm going to select is empty operation because I want to check if it's empty or not. And again, I'm getting this value from the webhook node. So I'm going to do add expression, current node, input data, JSON, and inside the body, I get the text. So now if I execute this node, you see that we didn't get any output in the true branch. But if I go to the false branch, we get the output in the false branch because the condition over here is false, and that's why we are getting the output in the false branch. So let's go ahead and connect the other nodes to the false branch so that we have the queries that's being written by QuestDB. So now, since we want to query to QuestDB, we'll add the QuestDB node. I'll select the credentials that I've already created. And now we are interested in executing a query. So I'm going to select execute query. And this query is going to be dynamic. So I'm going to click on the gear icon, add expression. And I'm just going to copy this query and paste it over here. Now, the only value that's changing over here is the time period. So this is 1M. So I'm going to get this from the webhook node. Again, current node, input data, JSON, body, and then the text. So if I execute this node, we'll get the value. So we're basically running a query and we are getting the value for that. So if you see in the table format, we get the average as well as a timestamp. Now this timestamp does not look so readable. So I'm going to use another core node of n8n, that's the date and time node, to convert it to a custom format. I'm going to get this value from the previous node, the current node, input data, JSON, and then timestamp. I'm going to give this the property name timestamp. And since I want a custom format, I'm going to select custom format. And then I am going to call this have DDMM. Okay. So DD basically stands for date. So we'll have today's date, that's 29 point, and then the month, that's 03, and then the hour, minute, and the second. So if I execute the node, you'll see that we got the timestamp in a new format. The last step is to add the Slack node so that we get the message on Slack. I'm going to select the Slack node. Now for this, we have to use create a credential. So I'm going to create a new credential since I created a new app. Now over here, we need the access token. So I'm going to copy this, add it over here, Bitcoins Slack app. Create. Another important thing to note over here whenever you are working with Slack is to give your application the right scopes. So I'm gonna go ahead and give my application the scope to send messages to Slack. So under bot token scopes, I'm gonna give it the chat write as well as the chat write public scope. Now you see that Slack prompted me to reinstall the application since we added new scopes. So I'm just gonna allow this application. Awesome. So the application is now updated, and now we want to send this message to Slack. We have to specify the channel. So I'm gonna get this again from the webhook node, but this time I am gonna use an expression. So this expression will basically remain same throughout all the messages that we send. And to make it look a bit pretty, I am gonna use fields, and I'm gonna call this time. So this will return the time, and then we'll add another field, which will be the value in USD. So now if I execute this node, it will send me the message on Slack. So you see that we got some output over here. Let's take a look how it looks on Slack. So we got the time and the value in USD as well. So we have completed the first part of this workflow. So this will basically output a value based on the input given by the user. So let's test it out with a different value. So I'm going to execute the workflow, and let's try it out for 30 seconds. We got a message, workflow got started, and we are getting the values for 30 seconds interval. So we now have a dynamic query which runs based on the input given by the user. But what if a user does not give an input? What if they just use this slash average command, right? So we still want to give them some output. So for that, we will use a static query. So I'm going to duplicate the node, connect it to the true branch, and I'm going to remove the expression. And by default for now, we want to give out the value sampling by 1 minute. Now if I execute this node, we won't see any data again. Why? Because the condition is false. See, we don't have any value in the true branch. So let's just change that. So I'm gonna execute the workflow and run this command this time without any parameters. So we got the message, workflow got started. That's good. And our QuestDB node also ran some queries. So we got the data for a sample of 1 minute. So I am gonna duplicate these nodes and connect it to the previous node so that we get so that I don't have to create the whole work all these nodes again and again. And if I open this node and execute this, you see that we now have this information. I'll also duplicate the Slack node and connect it with the date and time node. So now if I execute the workflow and call the average slash command, the workflow will get executed and it will run the static query and then execute it and then return me the information. Now at this point of time, there are a few nodes and we are kind of repeating mm, the nodes, right? And it might not make sense when you come to this workflow for a couple of days. So let's rename these nodes so that it makes more sense. So I'll first rename the if node, if no parameter, and then I'm going to rename it to default query, and this is dynamic query. The idea over here to rename the nodes is to help you get a better visual cue. So whenever you come back to your workflows and you take a look, you know what is happening at each particular node. So it gives you kind of a more readable format. So if no parameter, you run default query. If it's false, you run a dynamic query, right? So these are a few things that are really useful when you're building your workflows. Awesome. So Brian, now that we have completed this workflow, what's next? What else can we do with n8n and QuestDB?
Well, yeah, there's a ton of different things that we could do. I mean, so part of the benefits of using QuestDB is that we have extremely low latency, right, on reads, also on writes. But if you have a huge data set, right, and if you want to query across years worth of data, you're also going to get sub-second or a couple of 100 millisecond response times there. So we could reuse the same slash command, but to give us averages across some other data set that's maybe gigantic. Or what we could do is take inputs from different sources. So some of the n8n nodes that we have is Shopify, and we have some other e-commerce nodes, right? So we could be taking sales data from these other nodes, Salesforce, of course. So we could be ingesting from these nodes, and we could be running some queries on this based on metrics that we're interested in. So, I mean, the obvious thing would be for some BI insights, right? If I want to run the same kind of query at a different date, like what does the last week look like in this particular data set? How do my sales or conversions or visitors or signups, how does this look like? You're running the same query,
right?
But over a different time period. So you could easily rewrite this automation to look at this kind of data.
Awesome. Another idea that I have is, right now we are just posting some textual information. Maybe we can also, create graphics around that and, have a better visual cue of all this data. So maybe we create some graphs for this, which can be really helpful when, we are looking at the data.
Yeah, of course. So in QuestDB itself, we have some basic charting functionality and some visualization tools. But of course, I think images, especially of data like this first chart that we saw of the Apple stock, that this communicates the data almost instantly, right? So when we have the ability to make some nice looking charts and graphs of the data, it really helps us to understand what's going on.
Exactly, yeah. So after, let's just say you want to create a chart for this particular workflow, right? So just to give an idea, what you can do over here is right before the Slack node, you can connect a banner beer node or an API template node, right? Which allows you to manipulate some information on the image and create dynamic image and then send it to Slack. So you are not just sending out the textual information, but you're also giving them a graph over the time period.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you're also automating this kind of stuff is the perfect it's the perfect task for automation tools is for I want to create a graph of this week's insights on whatever kind of subject, because you're always going to be looking for a weekly report on some kind of business related information, right? So a BI dashboard where you're able to generate this kind of graphs makes total sense to me. This is something that you should be automating.
Awesome. So we showed you how you can connect different services to receive data and trigger your workflow. So just another quick time for poll. So and yeah, here you go. So let me know, what do you think? Is it possible to connect to services that don't have a node in n8n? Okay, so we got a mixed reply over here. That's interesting. Okay, so the answers are now switching over. So I'm just gonna wait for a couple of more seconds. Cool. Okay. So you can, connect to different services that don't natively have a node in n8n, provided that they have an API. So you can use the HTTP request node to connect to these services. So again, the HTTP request node has a lot of request methods. If you want to post some information, you can use the post method. If you want to delete something from your from the REST API endpoint, right, you can use the delete request method over here. So there is a lot of flexibilities uh, if your API uses any kind of authentication. You can select the authentication method and you can configure your authentication credentials, and then you can connect that service with n8n. Now let's just say if you want to trigger a workflow which is which does not have a native trigger node in n8n, right? So again, this is where you can use the webhook node. So with the webhook node, you can add the webhook URL to that particular service. So any external event happening in that service would trigger your workflow, and then you can build your own automation. So moving forward, Brian, where should we go and learn more about QuestDB?
Yeah, so we've open sourced the repo. It's on GitHub. So I would say if you're interested in having a look at what that looks like, feel free to check that out. Definitely, if you want to try it out, you can go to demo.questdb.io. There we have a couple of different data sets. There's the 10-year New York City taxi data set where you can query 1.6 billion rows. And that's in a couple of milliseconds probably. So I think people are going to be pretty impressed with the performance there on that. So yeah, definitely try out the demo. We also have a drop down there with some example queries to give you an idea of what you can do. And also you can just drop by our Slack. So we have a community Slack at slack.questdb.io. Just if you have any questions, drop by, say hello.
Awesome. And try out n8n. You can go to n8n.io to learn how you can get started with n8n. Go to n8n.cloud if you want to use our hosted services. And if you have any questions around n8n, feel free to ask them on community.n8n.io.
Hey, thank you, both of you. Shall we take a look at the questions now?
Yeah.
Sure.
Cool. Cool. I can see a few coming in here. The first I see is I do not use Slack at work. We use Mattermost. Can I use a similar workflow with other messaging services?
That's a really good question. So at n8n, we also use Mattermost, and we have a lot of workflows that use the slash command. So you can use this similar workflow with Mattermost. Just to give you an example of one of those slash command, we have a slash call command. So whenever we want to jump on a call with a teammate, we just use the slash call command, and it shares a video call link with our teammate so that we can connect with them, talk to them, have a meeting, and yeah, and that's the automation that we use.
Cool. Next one, I think this is for you, Brian. Do you have
Mhm.
authentication or user management in QuestDB?
So at the moment, you can authenticate using the Postgres credentials, which is the ones that we're using um, here in this workflow. Authentication for a larger number of users before you hit the database, that's coming soon.
Cool.
So
Right. And then, Harshal, I think this is for you. Can you download the workflows that are created in n8n? And if so, how can I share them?
Yeah, so you can download the workflows. So let me show you how it's done. So if you click on the option over here, you get the option to download. So it will basically download a JSON file. So if not sure if it will show up on the screen. So yeah, it will download a JSON file for me. The format is JSON, and you can then share this JSON file with your teammate or your colleague. And another interesting fact over here is, since I already have my credentials configured for Slack, right? This credentials won't be shared with anyone else. So the credentials are decoupled. So even if you're sharing your workflow, you're not sharing your credentials. So that's how you still remain safe while you're sharing your workflow.
Cool. And another thing that you can do is like select the nodes by dragging across them or do a command A, command C, and that copies the JSON of the workflows that you can again copy paste as well. Cool. The last one, I'm happy to take this, is does n8n support nodes and functionalities for custom IoT applications, namely MQTT, CoAP, OPC etc.? So what you can do with n8n is, so n8n does support a couple of different streaming inputs, especially when it comes to IoT applications or IoT applications. So we do support Kafka. We have support for, I think, AMQP 1.0. Correct me if I'm wrong. We also have MQTT support. And further things like we do not have anything existing, you can also use the function node to write custom JavaScript snippets. Just as an example, I purchased some cheap how do you smart bulbs, exactly, yeah, smart bulbs, because Philips Hue is too expensive, and essentially they used gateway called like the service was called 2 Year Smart, and they had an SDK available, but we didn't have a node for that, so we used their REST API and were able to connect with that. And in the process of authentication, it required a very specific kind of cryptography of the key before sending it through, which wasn't available at that moment in the crypto node. So you can also import libraries in the function node as you would while writing a Node.js code or maybe something in Python. But yeah, like if you are not familiar with programming, another thing you could do if you'd like a node for your for use cases is open feature request in the community.n8n.io, and the more efforts it gets, the sooner we'll be able to pick it up. And yeah, that's another way of requesting a feature that you might want in n8n. All right, so that seems like that's the last question. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for presenting Harshal and Brian. And in case we haven't answered your question yet, or if any other questions come up, yeah, please do visit us in community.n8n.io, and we shall get back to you very soon as well. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Bye.
you.
thanks.
Bye.
Bye bye.